It's time to look at the power of constraints, because without constraints, rigging would be totally impossible. In this lesson, I want to go over some of the common constraint settings and operators. We will practice using these constraints later on, but not in this lesson. This chapter is more likely going to be a reference for you to come back to if you forget anything. Now, when it comes to constraints, there are actually two types. There are object constraints and there are bone constraints. The only difference with these constraints are the levels on which they operate. Object constraints operate on the object container level, and bone constraints operate on the bones themselves. And that's where we want to put our constraints when we're rigging. Now, the object constraints are here in this little icon that looks like the avocado. And the bone constraints are in this tab down here that looks like an avocado with a bone through it. Our bone avocado tab will only be visible in pose mode. If we're in any other mode, it's not going to be there. So you need to have your armature object selected and be in pose mode. And there we go. So if we open up our menu for our object constraints, we've got a whole list there. Now these are very similar to our bone constraints, although we do have a few more options when dealing with bones. You'll see that they're organized into categories. We've got motion tracking, transform, tracking, and relationship. We won't be covering any of the motion tracking ones, purely because that is outside the scope of this course. We are not doing any motion tracking, we are doing some rigging, but I will explain all of the other constraints except for two of them. Down here we have our transform cache. This uses an external cache file that holds the transform information over time, and that's something animation related. We're not going to be dealing with that in this course. And the other one I'm not going to be discussing is this one here, the pivot constraint, mainly because of this word here, buggy. I have tried many times over the years to try and make something useful out of this constraint, but it is just way too buggy. Honestly, I don't know why this constraint is in the list. It doesn't work. So I'm going to do what everyone else does, and I'm going to pretend that that one doesn't exist. Now, the most important terminology that you need to remember are the terms owner and target. The owner is the bone where you're going to be placing the constraint on. That is the owner of the constraint. And the target is where the information is coming from. That is what the owner should be targeting. You can easily forget which one is which, but as long as you remember that the owner is where you put the constraint, then you can figure out the rest from that. The owner will also turn green to show you that there's a constraint on the bone too. So that's a helpful hint. Let's quickly have a look at how to set up a constraint. I will show you the long way first before I show you the faster way. Now here I have an armature object with two bones in it. I'm already in pose mode. You can tell because these bones are blue. You can also see my bone constraints tab down here. So to add a constraint, we need to select the bone that we want to add it to. That would be our owner bone. And then over in the bone constraint tab, we have this option up here that says add bone constraints. I'll just choose copy location for this tutorial. We now have a constraint on our bone, except our icon is red. The red icon means the constraint is not working. Something is wrong. And in our case, it's because we haven't finished setting it up. First, we need to give it an object name as the target. So we can click in here. That'll give us the name of all the objects in our scene. I only have one at the moment, so you can choose it like that. Or you could choose it via the eyedropper here. So if you click on that, then you can select the object from the outliner or in the 3D viewport. Any one of those ways will work. You can choose whichever way that you think is the coolest. There we go. We've got the target object in there, which is called armature. And because Blender has detected that this is an armature object, it's given us an extra input box saying, hey, what bone do you want me to target inside that armature? Now, we don't actually have an eyedropper for this one here. We just have to click in here and then choose. You can start typing. So if you have a long list of bones, you can type in here the name of the bone that you want. It will filter the list. However, we only have two bones here, so we can just choose it. And I've already gone ahead and called our target bone target. That was very handy. Good work, Wayne. So I'm going to choose that, and you'll see our bone snap over here. So this constraint is working, and you'll notice that our icon is no longer red. Now let me reset that, and I'll show you the fast way of doing that. If we want to add a constraint to the owner, we want to make sure that we select the target first, and the order really matters here. We need to select the target first, and then shift select the owner, so that the owner is selected last and it is the active bone. The way I like to think about it is this silly little saying in my head. I select the target, I say, who wants a constraint? And then I shift select this guy and go, I do. And that's the way that I remember the order. And once we've selected it in that way, we can use the shortcut Control-Shift-C, and we get our menu here, and we can just choose whatever one that we want, copy location. And it has already populated all that information for us. That was the much faster way of doing it. Let me just do that one more time. Select a target. Who wants a constraint? I do. Control-Shift-C, and then choose our constraint. Boom. It's that simple. Now, a lot of our constraints have target space and owner space. What is that, you mean? It's the coordinate system that the constraint is going to use to calculate what it's meant to do. So our target space is being evaluated in world space, and our owner is going to be evaluated in world space. Now, most of the time we want these to be the same. So either world space and world space, or sometimes we want it to be local space and local space. Now, space is a topic of a different video, but just as a quick example, for this copy location constraint, let me calculate the target in world space and the owner in local space. I'll just turn on my axes and jump to a different view. So in this little example, the owner will copy the location of the target. However, with the spaces set to be different, when the target moves along the world z-axis, the owner is going to move along its own local z-axis. But as I said, most of the time we want these to be set to the same thing, but space is something we're going to look at in depth in a different video. At the bottom here, we have our influence, and this is pretty much like a switch, or how much of effect this is going to have. When it's at 1, you can think about it as being 100%. When we slide it down to 0.5, it's going to be at 50%. And when it is at 0, it's effectively off. Now, don't confuse the influence with this mute button up here. This mute button just disables the constraint totally. So this is like the on-off switch. And here, this is an on-off slider. We can often drive this value to turn it on and off when we want. We can drive this switch up here as well, although it's more common to do it on the influence. And just next to our influence here, we have this little X button. And when we hover over this, it will tell you what it's called. It says disable and keep transform. So what does that mean? This button is an operator that will slide this down to 0, and then it will add that influence to our transforms up here. At the moment, you can see our bone is 0, 0, 0. But if I click this button, boom, you'll see that our influence is 0, but it has stayed in the same spot. So it has changed our transforms of our bone to match its position in space. Now, you probably won't use this very often in rigging, but you might find yourself using it in animation, but nonetheless, it is handy to know what it actually does. It will disable the constraint, but keep the current transforms of that constraint. Now, I think I've said this a few times already, but the order in which you place your constraints does matter. They are always calculated from the top down. So you need to think logically about what you're trying to achieve, because you might be overriding the effect of a constraint on your rig, and it will not function the way that you want it to. An example of that is here. I have 2 copy transform constraints. The first one will copy at 100%, and the second one will copy at 50%. If I have these in the wrong order, my rig is not going to work properly. But not to worry, I can reorder them by grabbing this icon here and dragging them around in the stack. Or you can click on the little arrow to open it up, and you can see we have a few options here, like move to first or move to last. Now, you can delete any individual constraint with this little X button here. If you click on that, it will remove that constraint. However, there's also an option in the menu. In the pose menu, we have constraints, and then we've got clear pose constraints. You can either choose the option here or the hotkey. I'll choose the hotkey, Control-Alt-C. There you go, those constraints are gone. Now, often you want to add the same constraint to a bunch of different bones at the same time, and you can actually do that. In this little example, I have owner number 5, and it has the copy transforms targeting our bone down here. And then I want to put that same constraint on all of these other bones. Now this one here, why is it green? I just want to show you that the operation that I'm about to do will wipe out any existing constraints. So it's something to be aware of. But in order to copy what was on here and put it on all of the other bones, we just need to select them all, making sure that our active bone is the one that we want to copy. And that's going to be the last bone that we select. Up here in our pose menu, we have pose constraints and copy constraints to selected bones. Now, we don't actually have a shortcut for this. So what I'm going to do, because we use this quite often, is I'm going to right click and say add to quick favorites. So now I can just hit Q and choose that option here. Boom. And you'll notice that it has copied the same constraint to all of those bones. And let's just check on our first bone here. That limit distance constraint that I had on there has been wiped out. That's just something to be aware of. So that's pretty much all of the shared settings and operators for the constraints. In the next few videos, I'll go over each of the constraints individually and explain the other settings that are specific to that constraint.